idea that China is going to end up like a Western-style society is a nonsense. China will remain China. China has only been a nation state since, roughly speaking, the 1880s. That's roughly speaking 140 years. Now, everyone knows that China's a lot older than 140 years. I mean, China, as a united polity, came into being in 211 BC. So it's at least 2,000 years old, and in some senses, of course, it's a lot older than 2,000 years. So the idea that somehow or other the last 140 years defines satisfactorily for us what China is an illusion. And if you want to understand China's development and what it means what being Chinese means for the Chinese and what China means for the Chinese, then it's not the last 140 years that gives us this. It is that civilizational history. What am I thinking of here? Confucian values, Guanxi, very distinctive relationship between the state and society, different problem really more or less than from any other country in the world. A very distinctive family unit, Chinese food, Chinese medicine. None of these things are a product of the last 140 years. All of these things are a product of an extremely long history, which at a minimum starts from Confucius, which is well before 211 BC. So this makes China very different from, for example, Western countries. China is essentially defined by its civilizational history and its civilizational inheritance. That's how it thinks of itself. Western countries, in contrast, essentially think of themselves overwhelmingly in terms of being nation states. I mean, the modern United States has only ever been a nation state. It's never been anything else. European countries are slightly different, but basically European countries think of themselves in terms of their national identity. That's why we call them nation states. And I would describe China as primarily being a civilization state and secondarily being a nation state. So I think there are three particular features of China as a civilization state that need to be taken into account. One is that there's extraordinary longevity, 2,000 years of history or more. Secondly, the relationship between Chinese civilization and political units, that's very unusual historically speaking, but there is a strong coincidence between the two. And thirdly is the sheer scale of China. 1/5 of the world's population. I mean, it is a continent really. It cannot be compared with the average nation state. It is something quite apart from that kind of experience. And also because it is so large, then far from being monolithic, far from being homogeneous, it's extremely diverse. And it's not one form of governance from Beijing, but there are many layers of governance. And for example, the provincial governments are a lot stronger and a lot more important than the vast majority of nation states around the world. So when we look at China, we don't look at one nation, one system, which is the classic pattern in a nation state. We look at one civilization, in many respects, several systems. Let me give you two examples of how this has left such a big, a marked difference, a markedly different footprint on China compared with Europe. Now, if you go back 2,000 years, Europe was united in the Holy Roman Empire, and China was divided into many different warring states. Now, over the next 2,000 years, Europe and China went in exactly the opposite directions. Europe started off united and then steadily fragmented and divided into many different territorial units. And ultimately today, when we think of Europe, we think of lots of different nation states. Sure, there's a European Union, but the major claim on people's allegiance in European countries, all of them, is their nation state, not the European Union. Now take China. Now China started off very divided, but over the next 2,000 years, waxing and waning as a process, it became a very large unified country. And the Chinese think of themselves in those terms and have a strong allegiance to that idea, not least because the periods of division were usually associated with the worst periods for people in Chinese history. So here we have a contrast. Default mode of Europe, division into lots of different nation states, little nation states. Default mode of China as a great united country. But it's very, very difficult to hold together a very large civilization state. It's very complicated because the centrifugal forces are very great, pulling it apart, and the centripetal force. So there's always a problem in relationship to China, with China, of holding the country, cohering the country together. And that is why the three most important political values to China are firstly, unity, secondly, order, thirdly, stability. That's not just true of government, that's true of the average Chinese person. Now, if you asked a European what were their three most important values, they would never say that. They would not list it. They wouldn't think in those terms. But for China, it's different. It's those three values. Why? Because it is a huge civilization state, and those become the imperatives of that kind of unit.